Pine Hollow has always been a city marked by quietness and isolation. Hidden by the dense trees of the surrounding forest, the city seemed to be a peaceful refuge for those seeking escape from the chaos of the great metropolises. But for the older ones, there was something profoundly wrong with Pine Hollow. Every few years, people disappeared without explanation, and the whispers of the forest intensified, as if an invisible presence was approaching. The older people spoke about the whispers with an unconfessed concern, but the younger residents ignored, considering only urban legends. No one dared to question, until the disappearances began again. Emma, a young woman from the Layton family, had disappeared months ago. His name, marked in the conversations of the whole village, was slowly wrapped in a terrifying silence. The city did not know what happened to her, but rumors pointed to the forest, that damned forest that year after year brought back the horrors that everyone wanted to forget. Emma was given as lost, and over the months, the grief turned into a distant memory, until, on a rainy night, she returned. His arrival was silent, without ceremony. When Emma reappeared, dirty and disoriented, the whole city shivered. She walked the empty streets with empty eyes, her expression in shock, without saying a word. Her family, who had received her with open arms, soon realized something was terribly wrong. Emma was not the same. There was no explanation for his return, his eyes were lost in a distance that no one could reach. In a tense meeting at the Layton's house, Emma finally broke the silence. His face, marked by a deep fear, looked at all those present, but his voice did not echo. She wrote in haste on a piece of paper, the words trembling with the strength of her anguish, "I have made an agreement." Those in the room were shocked. Clara, her mother, tried in vain to understand, but Emma's words were simple and devastating. She had made a pact with something in the forest, an ancient and evil entity known as King Hollow. "He is coming back," wrote Emma, her trembling hands passing quickly through the paper. "And nothing will be as before." The revelation fell like a bomb, shattering the little piece that was left in Pine Hollow. Emma, with her eyes wide and her breath gasping, began to tell what she remembered of her experience in the forest. She spoke of the whispers that accompanied her during the days of her disappearance, the visions of shadows that persecuted her, and the promises made by the Hollow King, a supernatural force that inhabits the depths of the forest and that, for generations, it feeds on the soul of the residents of Pine Hollow. She did not remember everything, but knew that by making the covenant she had been chosen to bring back the curse that haunted the city. And now, she felt, the worst was to come. But the residents of Pine Hollow, stunned and frightened, did not know how to react. Many, incredulous, preferred to walk away. Some tried to hide the truth, drowning out Emma's accounts with rational excuses and explanations, while others began looking at the forest with renewed fear. For those who believed his words, an unbearable tension took hold of the city, and the fear of an ancient evil that had never been completely eradicated spread quickly. The town of Pine Hollow, once again, seemed to be at the mercy of something that it could not control. Emma's return brought no comfort. It just brought more questions. What happened to her in the forest? What did that pact with King Oko really mean? And the most terrifying of all, was it too late for the city to escape? In the days following Emma's return, a cloud of uncertainty and fear hovered over Pine Hollow. The city that once seemed to be a quiet place and immune to the terrors of the outside world was now under invisible pressure. Emma, who was once a young woman full of life and promise, had become a shadow of what she was. She began to avoid any contact with the residents, isolating herself in her room, where she spent most of the time in silence, with her eyes fixed on the window, watching the forest with a look of despair. His family, unable to cope with pain and fear, was divided. Her father, Walter Layton, insisted that Emma was just traumatized and needed time to recover, but her mother, Clara, knew something else was going on, something beyond human comprehension. In the city, rumors began to spread. The elders, who always whispered about the Hollow Kings and the mysteries of the forest, now spoke even more quietly. Some claimed that evil was about to return more strongly, that the curse of the forest had never really been broken, but only postponed. Others, more skeptical, tried to minimize the events, calling Emma's reports delusions caused by suffering. However, even the most unbelieving began to notice the strange behavior of animals around the city. The silence of the forest seemed denser, more oppressive. The whispers no longer came only from the darkness of the trees, but infiltrated by the nights, spreading through the fields and houses, like an insidious presence. As time passed, the number of disappearances increased alarmingly. The first to disappear were some of the more reclusive residents, those who barely mixed with the others. When their bodies were never found, fear spread, but many refused to face the truth. The city was gradually getting used to the idea that no one was safe. And then, demonstrations began. In the beginning, it was something subtle, doors that closed themselves, lights that blinked without explanation. But soon the manifestations became more intense and terrifying. One night during a meeting at the Leighton house, the windows of the windows shook violently, and a whisper sound was heard by all present coming from the direction of the forest. It was a muffled, almost unintelligible voice that seemed to call someone's name. Everyone looked in silence, fear spreading on their faces. Emma, now visibly disturbed, began to have panic attacks and frequent hallucinations. She claimed to hear the whispers in her head all the time, calling her back to the forest as if the force of King Oko was trying to drag her back into his domain. She described in detail the shadows that followed her, deformed human figures with empty eyes and mouths that moved without emitting sound. She saw them at night, in the shadows of the forest, watching her, waiting. And as she said, they were not only specters, but something deeper, something that did not belong to the world of the living. Fear reached a new peak when a group of children disappeared, all of them residents of Pine Hollow. None of them were found, and the city began to be on high alert. It was at this point that Clara decided to seek answers. Along with a few allies, including Thomas, a former town resident and expert on local folklore, she began a secret investigation into the origin of the curse that hovered over Pine Hollow. The two began to study ancient texts and legends that spoke of the King Oko, the entity that Emma had mentioned. According to the records, King Oko was not just a force of nature but an ancient creature, a primordial being that had been summoned centuries ago by city dwellers in search of protection against unknown forces. However, the covenant made with him did not come without a price. The entity would require, each generation, the surrender of souls. Emma, now powerless to contain the terror that had gripped her, revealed to Clara an even more frightening secret. The only way for the city to escape the curse would be to destroy the entity's core, something hidden somewhere in the forest. However, Emma did not know where exactly the center of power of King Hollow was. She only knew that once the entity was stronger, there would be no escape. While Clara and Thomas were desperately looking for a solution, the whispers in the forest began to get louder, more urgent. The city, now on the verge of collapse, was divided between those who wanted to face the darkness and those who still refused to believe in the impossible. The fear became palpable, and Pine Hollow began to close in on itself, as if preparing for the end. But the worst was yet to come, and the forest wasn't just watching, it was waiting. As winter approached, the town of Pine Hollow became increasingly unrecognizable. The air was charged with a tense silence, interrupted only by whispers that seemed to come from the trees, which swayed in a strange way, as if they responded to those who dared approach. The nights had become longer, and the presence of King Oko, the entity that had been evoked centuries ago, seemed to take over the city. The shadows of the forest approached civilization, invading the streets and infiltrating the houses. Evil was growing, and the inhabitants of Pine Hollow knew that the end was closer than ever. Emma, now in a state of almost complete despair, began to communicate with the whispers of the forest. In her moments of lucidity, she told Clara and Thomas about what she saw and heard, but her words were already entangled, as if her own soul was being corrupted. The pact she had made with King Oko was taking a terrible toll on herself. She was no longer a mere victim, she was becoming a part of what King Oko was, and with that, she began to lose her identity, as if her essence were being absorbed by darkness. Clara, determined to save her daughter and the city, followed the only remaining track, the entity's core. Together with Thomas and a few brave villagers, she ventured through the forest at night when the cloak of darkness seemed denser. With each step, the air became heavier, as if the earth itself was breathing. The ground, covered with dry leaves, cracked under his feet, but there was no sound of life in the forest. It was as if the animals had left that place long ago, leaving only shadows. The walk was long and harrowing, and every turn on the trail seemed to lead to a deeper, darker place. Emma, who accompanied them in a state of delirium, spoke in murmurs. With every word that came out of her mouth, she seemed to move further away from her humanity, closer than she was waiting for her in the darkness. Clara felt the loss of her daughter, not only physically but spiritually. Emma was transforming, and she knew the whole town was about to do the same. Finally, they reached the heart of the forest, where the air was denser and the silence more absolute. There, in the middle of a dark clearing, they found an altar of ancient stones, covered with moss and roots. In the center, a mysterious object, a sphere of pulsating energy, seemed to shine with a supernatural light. It was the core, the source of King Hollow's power, and what he represented, the link between the world of the living and the world of the dead. When Clara approached, a wave of energy made her stop. The shadows around the clearing began to move, and the sound of a growing whisper became present, as if the forest itself was whispering their names. Emma, in a low cry, approached the altar and reached out her hands as if attracted by an invisible force. Emma's eyes, once full of life, were now empty and opaque, and her body seemed to be consumed by darkness. It was too late. Clara tried to run towards her, but the shadows began to materialize around her, wrapping her in a dense fog. Each step seemed to be more difficult, as if the forest itself was resisting its presence. Thomas shouted, trying to pull her away, but the weight of the Pine Hollow curse was on them. There was no escape. The city had been marked, and the entity was ready to collect its final price. At the last moment, Clara reached Emma, desperately trying to free her from the pact. But before she could touch her, an invisible force pushed her back, and Emma, with a look of pure terror, turned and advanced into the core of the entity. When his hands touched the sphere, the earth trembled. The forest seemed to scream in agony, and a wave of black energy spread across the clearing. The shadows rose like human figures, with deformed faces and distorted bodies, screaming in pain. The Hollow King, a colossal and indefinite presence, manifested before them, a creature made of darkness and pure evil. His power was at its peak, and the city of Pine Hollow, with its inhabitants and secrets, was doomed to be a part of it forever. Clara, holding Thomas as the two were consumed by darkness, looked one last time into the forest. Pine Hollow was already hopelessly lost. Emma had become an extension of King Hollow, one of the many souls consumed by the Covenant, and her city would now be his eternal prison. And as the shadows began to swallow everything, the only sound left was that of whispers. And so, Pine Hollow disappeared, leaving behind only a bitter memory of a place where the darkness never ceased. The road was winding through the forest, the old asphalt almost covered by tall trees that stretched out like arms, as if they wanted to swallow the road. The small town of Pine Hollow was far from the hustle and bustle of big cities, a quiet place where everyone knew each other but also where rumors flew from mouth to mouth with ease. The Harris family was in search of a new life, away from the chaos of the metropolis. Moving to a detached house on the outskirts of Pine Hollow seemed like the perfect opportunity to start over. Jason Harris, the family patriarch, drove the car with his eyes fixed on the horizon. His wife, Emily, sat beside him, trying to comfort the children who, wide-eyed, watched the way as the cottage approached. Lily, the youngest daughter, was 9 years old and excited about the move. Ethan, the 13-year-old older brother, didn't seem so excited. He was more interested in the phone, ignoring the world around him. The trees and shadows of the forest that closed around the road seemed more gloomy and oppressive with each kilometer, but this Jason attributed to the nostalgia of the place, a small town with a past that carried more legends than real stories. The Harris's house was large, old, but with a rustic beauty that seemed taken from a fairy tale. Upon arriving, Emily's first impression was enchanting, but a strange sensation formed in the depths of her mind, as if the place were watching. She tried to keep her thoughts away, but she couldn't. The house was on the edge of a dense forest, where twisted trees seemed to bend over the ground, and the wind passed through them with a melancholy sound. The children were eager to explore, but Jason sent them inside to start unpacking. The day was long with a stuffy heat, and as the sun set, a feeling of discomfort spread through the house. Ethan was the first to notice something strange. He was on the second floor, organizing his things, when he saw a shadow in the trees through the window. Something that seemed to move in a strange way, as if the forest itself had life. He thought it was some animal, maybe a deer or a coyote, but the shadow seemed smarter. He took away the thoughts from his mind, returning to work. As night approached, the atmosphere in the house became darker and more closed. Emily was in the kitchen, preparing dinner, when she felt a chill. The wind was blowing strong now, and she could swear she heard a soft whisper coming from the window. It was a breeze, she thought. Or maybe it was the wood of the house moving with the wind. But the whispers continued. And they were not only sounds. Something seemed to move in the shadows of the house. Emily tried to ignore it, focusing on the dinner, but the feeling of being watched did not leave her. That night, when everyone was finally gathered in the room, the first strange noises began. Gentle steps upstairs. Jason and Emily exchanged glances, but no one said anything. The children were already sleeping, but the silence of the house seemed amplified, almost like an echo of the shadows that hid in the walls. Later, as everyone settled in for the night, Jason had a feeling that the house would never really be quiet. Something was there, something that could not be explained. The forest, with its tall and thick trees, looked even more imposing at night, and the sounds coming from there were different. Whispers that seemed to accompany the wind, murmurs that were lost among the leaves. Jason thought it was the sound of the forest, but a part of him knew it wasn't. The forest, with its ancient legends and stories about disappearances, seemed more alive than ever, as if it was waiting for something. The next day, while exploring the garden and surrounding grounds, the Harris family found more strange symbols carved into trees near the forest. They were not ordinary marks, but symbols with distorted forms, as if someone had made them in a hurry and with a purpose. "They are just old tree marks," said Jason, trying to keep the optimism up. But Emily couldn't help but wonder who did it, and why there seemed to be a sense of warning in the marks, as if they were warning not to approach. The feeling of restlessness grew. At that moment, no one knew, but the house was already testing them. The forces hiding in the forest would not allow the Harris family to stay there without paying a price. The shadows, the strange figures and the whispers in the dark nights were only the first signs that something much darker was about to be revealed. And as the house seemed increasingly lonely, with the forest closing in around it, the Harris began to realize that perhaps the peace they sought in Pine Hollow was only a distant echo. The days passed slowly, with the Harris family's routine adapting to new and disconcerting events that began to take over their lives. The house seemed increasingly distant from the idea of refuge that Jason and Emily had imagined. The silence of the forest was oppressive, and the night sounds became sharper every night, as if something moved around them. The feeling that they were being watched never moved away, an invisible presence that made everyone's skin shiver. Soon, family members began to notice changes in the behavior of children. Lily, the younger one, talked about the tall shadow she saw in the trees at night. "She calls me to play," she said, her eyes shining with excitement, as if she didn't know that something was wrong with her story. Ethan, with his usual cynicism, mocked her, saying they were just monsters under the bed. But Emily, an attentive mother, began to be worried about Lily's reports. The child seemed so convinced, so scared, and that made her question what was happening. In the following nights, the noises became more intense. Steps in the corridors, scratches on the walls, and even muffled screams that seemed to come from the forest, but so far away and distorted that no one knew exactly where. Jason tried to rationalize it. Maybe it was the wind, or some animal, he thought. But things were becoming hard to ignore. Something was happening. Something was infiltrating the boundaries between the natural and the supernatural, and it was starting to affect everyone in the house. It was on a particularly strange night that the first true encounter with evil occurred. Jason woke up in the middle of the morning, feeling that something was wrong. He got up from the bed, the cold of the night enveloping him, and went to the corridor. As he passed through the children's room, he heard the whispers. They were low and almost incomprehensible, but there was a distressing tone in the words, as if someone was trying to say something, but could not. When he approached, he saw Lily, the youngest daughter, standing by the window. His eyes were fixed in the forest, in a trance that made Jason's spine freeze. "Lily, what are you doing?" he asked, his voice hesitantly. She did not respond immediately. When she turned her face to him, her eyes were empty, almost as if she didn't recognize him. "She's waiting for me outside," said Lily, pointing to the forest with a frightening calm. "She wants me to go with her." Jason pulled her away from the window, but something inside him already knew that it was not a childish whim. Something was really there, something that was calling Lily. He closed the curtains and went to Ethan's room, who was surprisingly awake, looking out of the window too, with the same expression of fear on his face. "Did you see too?" Jason asked, in a low voice. Ethan nodded. "I saw the shadow. That thing, on the edge of the forest. It's not normal, Dad." As they spoke, the noises continued. Whispers that seemed to come from all sides. Something moved between the trees, crawling, waiting. It was impossible to escape from the evil that was infiltrating the house, and soon it became clear to everyone that he would not let them go easily. In the following days, the atmosphere in the house became increasingly unbearable. Emily, a woman usually full of energy and confidence, began to lose control. She heard the whispers too, but what haunted her most was Lily's empty gaze, which seemed to be getting further and further away. The children seemed to not understand the real danger, while Jason, struggling with the growing feeling of dread, tried to keep everyone calm. But as the tension increased, he felt the presence of the high shadow approaching. There was something in the forest, something old, that I didn't want the family to stay. Night fell once more, and with it came terror. This time the evil was no longer confined to the forest. A figure appeared at the door of the house, a high shadow with undefined contours, but with the feeling of a powerful presence. Emily saw her first, as she looked out the kitchen window. She was not human, but looked like a silhouette, a form that crawled slowly through the garden, watching the house. Around them, the whispers became louder, clearer, as if something was trying to communicate with them, a dark warning that they were being watched. Jason went to the door to investigate, but when he opened it, there was nothing. Only the silence, the sound of the forest and the echoes of words that still hovered in the air. Fear now took over them in an absolute way. Every sneaky look, every step in the dark, every sound becoming more and more loaded with malice. The most frightening of all was the growing sense that the forest was alive, that it watched them and waited for them. Something ancestral, an evil presence that was not willing to let them go. They were trapped there, with the house and the forest, with the high shadow that drew them into their abyss of terror. The children began to exhibit even more strange behaviors. Lily, who was only scared before, now seemed delighted by the idea of following the shadow that called her. Ethan, in turn, became increasingly withdrawn, as if he was absorbing something from the forest, something that could not be named. Jason and Emily's fear turned into panic. They were losing control of the situation. The evil had revealed itself, and now there was no doubt, the house, the forest and the supernatural forces that inhabited Pine Hollow would not let the Harris family leave. The tension in the Harris house has reached its peak. Each day seemed like a struggle to keep sanity, but the signs were clear. The evil that surrounded them was not something they could face with logic or courage. The house and the forest, with its invisible forces and suffocating presence, began to consume all that was left of normality in the family life. The nights became unbearable. The silence was interrupted only by whispers, now stronger and closer, as if echoing on the walls, floor and doors. Jason, exhausted, tried to gather his family together to discuss a way out of there, but a feeling of powerlessness dominated him. With each attempt to act, something seemed to hold their feet in the house. The forest seemed to close more and more, and even if they tried to escape, something pulled them back. Lily, who was only curious before, now seemed completely captivated by the high shadow that called her to the forest. Her eyes were empty, as if something had possessed her. She walked through the nights towards the garden, always alone, always drawn to the trees, where the shadows seemed to stretch out in a threatening way. Jason and Emily, fearing the worst, stopped her, but she resisted with a strength unusual for a child. "I must go," she whispered, as if she was no longer herself. Ethan was increasingly withdrawn. He no longer talked about what he saw, but his gaze lost in the void said it all. In his eyes, Jason saw the same despair he felt, but with an absence, as if the soul of the sun was being consumed by the same evil that lay on the house. It was a moonless night that the final terror came. Jason woke up suddenly, feeling the cold and heavy air inside his room. Something was wrong. He got up, but as he left the room, he saw the doors of the house locked, as if something was trying to block his way out. The sound of whispers increased, now unmistakable, as if ancient voices were mumbling in an unknown language. The steps on the stairs began. The floor itself seemed to vibrate with a palpable energy. He ran to Emily's room, but when he came in, the scene before his eyes left him paralyzed with terror. Emily was standing by the window, eyes fixed on the forest. Lily was out there, alone, walking slowly toward the edge of the forest, toward the high shadow. She was with an empty smile, as if being guided by a force beyond human comprehension. The shadow was there, now more clear than ever, a huge and undefined presence that moved among the trees. Jason tried to run to the door to keep Lily from leaving, but the doors closed before his hand reached the doorknob, as if the house was closing around him. He cried out for his daughter's name, but there was no answer. The forest whispered now as if the land itself was laughing at his despair. With his nerves at their core, he grabbed Emily by the arms and tried to run towards the back door, but the house swallowed them. The sound of trees creaking and shadows moving became a macabre melody that enveloped them completely. It was then that the shadow materialized. And in an instant, the whole house seemed to shake. The walls were contorted and the floor crumbled, making the family fall to their knees, feeling the weight of a supernatural power that was beyond comprehension. The cries of Emily and Jason echoed through the house, but were soon swallowed by the darkness that surrounded them. When the shadow touched the door of the house, a deafening noise took hold of the environment, as if the house was being crushed by an invisible force. The trees around the house began to shake violently, as if they were witnessing the death of that place, and the sky instantly darkened, giving way to a cloak of darkness. There was no escape. Jason's last breath was muffled by the dark mist that filled the air as the house crumbled around him. The children cried, but their voices disappeared in the wind. The forest, with its threatening presence, swallowed up the last light that remained, and the house of Harris sank into the abyss of what had been awakened. The next morning, Pine Hollow woke up as always, quiet and silent, with the fog covering the deserted streets. The house of the Harris was completely destroyed, leaving no more than ruins that were dissolved in the earth, as if they had never existed. The forest, however, seemed more alive, its trees denser and its shadows deeper. There was no sign of Jason, Emily, Ethan, or Lily. But the residents of Pine Hollow knew, as they always did, that the forest never lets anyone go. She keeps the secrets of what happened there, and now she had another macabre story to whisper in its silent streets. The whispers never ceased. They were back, stronger than ever, and now, more than ever, they waited for a new soul to be swallowed up by the darkness of Pine Hollow. Clara Layton had decided that she needed a fresh start. After months of turmoil in her professional and personal life, the freelance journalist saw in the small town of Pine Hollow an opportunity to escape from the chaos and pressure of urban life. The city seemed quiet, far enough from everything that tormented it. Upon arrival, it was greeted by an idyllic setting, cobbled streets, wooden houses, and dense vegetation that took care of the surrounding hills. It was the kind of place where everything seemed to move slowly, as if time had forgotten to pass. Clara rented a detached house on the outskirts of the city, about a walk in the forest that marked the horizon. The property, although old, had an undeniable charm. She loved the idea of living alone, without the distractions of the modern world, just her and the sounds of nature. The house had a large balcony and a large garden, but what drew the attention was the absolute silence that surrounded the place. A silence that seemed to carry weight, as if there was something the city and forest watchmen didn't want her to know. In the first days, Clara took time to get acquainted with the city. Pine Hollow, with its welcoming appearance, seemed like a city forgotten by time, with few shops, a single restaurant and a local market. However, something seemed out of place. When talking to the inhabitants, everyone seemed to hide a secret. Questions about the history of Pine Hollow were often diverted with a forced smile or a sudden change of subject. Clara, as an experienced journalist, recognized these subtleties but tried not to be affected. Perhaps it was just the peculiar way of a small-town dwellers. It was on one of those lonely afternoons that Clara began to hear the whispers for the first time. She was on the balcony, with a cup of tea in her hands, looking out over the grove that extended beyond the garden. The light wind rocked the trees, but there was something else, something she could not identify. They were low voices, almost imperceptible, as if someone was talking in the distance, but soon disappeared when she tried to focus on them. Clara stood up, thinking that maybe it was just the sound of the wind passing through the branches, but the feeling persisted. She felt a shiver in the spine, something that could not explain. As she investigated more about the city, Clara began to find clues to the rumors that were surfacing in her mind. On a visit to the local library, she came across an old newspaper, yellowed by time, which reported the history of several disappearances in the city, all occurring decades ago. What caught her attention most was the report of a series of people who had been seen for the last time in areas near the forest, never to be found again. Many of the city's residents believed that these disappearances were linked to an ancient legend about a cult that worshipped an entity called King Hollow. A being that, according to the reports, would reside in the heart of the forest, waiting to return. Intrigued, Clara tried to ask the older residents about this story. However, everyone seemed to have an aversion to talking about it. The mayor, when questioned, gave a nervous laugh and said that it was all just a story invented to scare the children. But something in his look made Clara think otherwise. She decided to follow her instinct and investigate further. As time went on, the whispers began to become more frequent, more intense. At night, when the wind was calm and the shadows of the forest stretched out, Clara began to hear those low voices again. Some words were audible, but sounded like fragments of sentences, difficult to understand. A feeling of restlessness took hold of her, and the silence around the house began to feel oppressive, as if the forest were watching. In a particularly quiet night, Clara took courage and decided to go into the forest to investigate on her own. She took a lantern and went into the trees, but soon realized that the forest seemed denser and more impenetrable than she had imagined. The air was heavy, and with each step, the sound of whispers became clearer, closer. She could almost feel a presence next to her, as if something was guiding her, or perhaps watching her. It was then that she found a small clearing, where the air seemed denser and the environment inexplicably colder. In the center of the clearing was an old stone altar, covered with moss and with strange symbols engraved on its surface. Clara approached cautiously, the sound of whispers now almost deafening. A sense of imminent danger enveloped her, and she took a step back, determined to return to the safety of her home. As he walked back to the city, his heart beat fast. Something was deeply wrong in Pine Hollow, and Clara knew it would not be easy to unearth the truth. She was in a city that kept secrets that nobody wanted to tell, and more importantly, something in the forest, perhaps the King Hollow himself, did not want her to discover these secrets. But she was determined to move on, knowing that in doing so not only her sanity, but also her life, were at risk. In the following days, Clara found herself immersed in a growing obsession with the story of Pine Hollow. The discovery of the altar in the forest had shaken her deeply. She could not stop thinking about the strange symbols, the inexplicable cold that enveloped her and the whispers that continued to echo in her mind. There was something very old and evil in the city, something that could not be ignored. Every night, the whispers increased, as if the city was calling for it, or worse, the forest itself was approaching his house. Clara spent hours in the library, looking for more clues about the cult of the Ash Circle and its worship to King Hollow. What he found was even more disturbing. Old records of disappearances, dating back more than 100 years, spoke of people who had left the city and never returned, with vague reports of shadowy figures seen in the forest. The stories suggested that these people were not victims of simple disappearances, but of rituals. Each of the disappearances was linked to a macabre event performed by the cult members, a ritual intended to invoke the entity, the King Hollow, who was said to be an ancestral being, a spirit that inhabited the forest and had the power to manipulate people's minds, driving them to madness or, in some cases, death. But what caught his attention most was the mention of a book, a lost grimoire, which contained the rituals and secrets of the Ash Circle. They said that this book had been hidden for a long time, and those who tried to find it ended up disappearing or going mad. Clara felt a mixture of fear and fascination. The book seemed to be the key to understanding what was really going on in Pine Hollow. Determined to find out more, Clara began to question the older residents of the city, but each time she touched on the subject of the cult or disappearances, the reactions were the same: sneaky glances, nervousness, and an attempt to change the subject. Some even avoided her completely. The atmosphere of secrecy in the city seemed to be thicker than she imagined. In one of these failed attempts, Clara went to the house of a man named Elias, one of the few older residents still living in Pine Hollow. Elijah was known to be eccentric, but had lived in the city all his life and therefore knew more about the past than anyone else. When she approached him, he looked at her with suspicion, but after a long silence, finally spoke. "You don't know what you're looking for, girl," he said with a husky voice, wide-eyed. "That cult, they haven't disappeared, Clara. They are among us. King Hollow has never gone. He is just waiting." Claire felt a shiver. Before she could ask more, Elijah stood up abruptly and left, muttering something incomprehensible. She stood there alone, with the feeling that she had touched something much more dangerous than she imagined. There was a greater, darker truth that she was just beginning to understand. With a fast heart, Clara returned to her home, where the whispers were more intense than ever. But something had changed. They seemed to be closer, as if they originated from the forest itself, which was just behind her house. She could no longer ignore them. That night, Clara could not sleep. The whispers became voices, clear and distinct, whispering her name. She heard the words clearly, something like an invitation, or perhaps a warning: "You are seeking us, Clara, now cannot return." The voice was deeply disturbing, as if it came from within the forest, but at the same time it was in his own mind. Determined to find out the truth, Clara decided to venture once again into the forest. She was aware that she was running a great risk, but the weight of curiosity drove her, like an invisible force that dragged her into the unknown. In the dead of night, with a lantern in her hands and a feeling that she was no longer alone, she went back into the forest. This time, she felt that something was following her, something bigger, deeper, something watching every movement of hers. The path to the clearing seemed more difficult, more dense. The trees closed around her, as if the forest was trying to swallow every step she took. When she finally reached the clearing, she found something that made her stop immediately. There was a circle of stones, similar to those she had seen on the altar before, but this time in the center there was a skeletal figure, covered by a black cloak that moved with the wind. Clara took a step forward, but her flashlight suddenly went out, leaving her in complete darkness. The figure, however, was not alone. Around her, Clara saw other shadows moving between the trees. They were grotesque silhouettes, with eyes that shone in the darkness. Clara felt a wave of panic take hold of her, but something, perhaps curiosity or the need for response, kept her still. A voice, cold and deep, sounded in his mind: "You already know too much, Clara." Before he could react, a cold hand closed on his shoulder. She turned quickly, but there was no one there. Only the darkness. And the whispers, now in a desperate frequency, echoing as if they were trying to pull it out of there. Clara knew she was in danger, but she also knew there was no turning back. She needed to understand what was going on in Pine Hollow, and more importantly, she needed to know what King Hollow was before he found her first. The fear that Clara felt as she walked back home was palpable, like a shadow that followed her every step. She did not know what she had actually seen in that forest, or if the darkness had moved her mind. But one thing was certain: Pine Hollow had a secret that she could no longer ignore. The Hollow King, the entity mentioned by Elijah, and the cult were irreversibly connected to what was happening in the city. In the following days, Clara avoided going out at night, but the whispers did not give rest. They were everywhere, in their house, in the deserted streets, in the library, as if they were the very fabric of the city. She tried to concentrate on her work, but could not write anymore, her mind was completely dominated by the mystery of the forest and the cult. The city, which before seemed to be only a quiet refuge, now became a suffocating place where she felt the weight of a presence that never left her alone. While digging deeper into the old archives, Clara discovered something even more disturbing. The cult of the Ash Circle was not just active in the past as she had imagined. The cult had remained secret, infiltrated in the very structure of the city. Its members remained in the shadows, guided by an unshakable belief in the Hollow King, which, according to legends, could only be awakened by a final sacrifice, the sacrifice of a pure soul. Clara felt her body tremble at understanding what it meant. She was the target. One afternoon, as she was returning from the library, Clara saw a familiar figure standing at the entrance of her house. Elias. He was with grave face and eyes injected with panic. Before she could ask what was going on, he pulled her inside quickly, looking sideways as if he feared being seen. "You're in danger, Clara," he said, his voice trembling. "They know you know. You saw, didn't you? You heard the whispers, you found the altar. Now, they are coming." Clara was silent, the pieces of the puzzle finally coming together. Elijah, with his suspicious air and hasty words, seemed to know more than he had let on. He looked her in the eye, as if seeking some kind of confirmation in his gaze, and then spoke in a low tone, almost whispering, I am one of the last. The Circle of Ash is still in operation, but not like before. Now they are closer, and they have decided what to do with you." That last sentence made Clara's blood freeze. Before she could react, Elijah spoke quickly, explaining that the cult had branched into different factions, all still devoted to the Hollow King, who, according to legend, was an entity ruling the forest and needed a sacrifice to maintain its strength. He was the last remnant who tried to stop the rituals, but he could do nothing alone. Clara's fate was already sealed. "They will come at night," said Elijah. "The forest, the city. King Hollow will seek their soul." That night, Clara locked herself in her house. But she knew what would happen next could not be avoided. The whispers, now louder and more urgent, became an unbearable pressure on his mind. She knew the forest was calling for her. The Hollow King was waking up. And she had no time left. As the night progressed, Clara began to see shadowy figures moving in the deserted streets of the city, shadows that seemed to merge with the trees, with the houses, as if they were part of their own environment. She tried to close the curtains, lock the doors, but something inside her knew that it would not be enough. The cult was close, and the entity was lurking. That's when she heard the scream. A high-pitched, distorted scream that cut through the silence of the night coming from the forest. Clara felt her body freeze. It was the cry of a soul being consumed, dragged into darkness. Without thinking, she went to the door, but before she could leave, Elijah's shadow appeared before her. He was pale, with glazed eyes and a countenance of who had lost all hope. "You can't leave. If you go into the forest, you'll never come back," he cried, almost desperate. But Claire, determined to face whatever it was, pushed Elijah aside and ran into the forest. What was happening there was greater than it, greater than any rational explanation that could have. She needed to understand, she needed to see with her own eyes. The forest seemed alive, pulsating. The trees closed around it, and the darkness seemed to swallow it at every step. The whispers became cries, a collective voice echoing her soul. When she reached the altar, she saw the figure. He was there, the Hollow King, a skeletal creature with empty eyes, as if his presence drained all energy around. The earth was shaking, and the atmosphere was charged with a supernatural force. She tried to back down, but the figure looked at her directly. Her eyes shone with a spectral light, and Clara felt a wave of terror flood her mind. The feeling of being consumed by something ancestral left her without strength. "You came, at last," the voice of King Hollow echoed in his mind, cold as the wind that cut through the forest. You will be the sacrifice that brings our age back." But before the ritual could be completed, a deafening cry cut off the night. Elijah appeared, running desperately towards Claire. He was screaming, but Clara could no longer hear. Everything became cloudy. The shadows began to consume the forest, and she felt her consciousness dissolve into darkness. The town of Pine Hollow would never be the same. And Clara, his name would be more a legend, whispered by the trees and shadows that waited for another sacrifice. The Hollow King was freed, and the city had once again been taken. The cycle has begun again.